or that direct communication and tradition, of which one immediately thinks, are adequate for the task. Social psychology is in general little concerned with the manner in which the required continuity in the psychic life of succeeding generations is established. A part of the task seems to be performed by the inheritance of psychic dispositions, which, however, need certain incentives in the individual life in order to become effective. This may be the meaning of the poet's words: strive to possess yourself of what you have inherited from your ancestors. The problem would appear more difficult if we could admit that there are psychic impulses which can be so completely suppressed that they leave no traces whatsoever behind them. But that does not exist. The greatest suppression must leave room for distorted substitutions and their resulting reactions. But in that case we may assume that no generation is capable of concealing its more important psychic processes from the next. For psychoanalysis has taught us that in his unconscious psychic activity every person possesses an apparatus which enables him to interpret the reactions of others, that is to say, to straighten out the distortions which the other person has effected in the expression of his feelings. By this method of unconscious understanding of all customs, ceremonies, and laws which the original relation to the primal father had left behind, later generations may also have succeeded in taking over this legacy of feelings. There is another objection which the analytic method of thought itself might raise. We have interpreted the first rules of morality and moral restrictions of primitive society as reactions to a deed which gave the authors of it the conception of crime. They regretted this deed and decided that it should not be repeated and that its execution must bring no gain. This creative sense of guilt has not become extinct with us. We find its asocial effects in neurotics producing new rules of morality and continued restrictions in expiation for misdeeds committed or as precautions against misdeeds to be committed. But when we examine these neurotics for the deeds which have called forth such reactions, we are disappointed. We do not find deeds, but only impulses and feelings which sought evil, but which were restrained from carrying it out. Only psychic realities, and not actual ones, are at the basis of the neurotic's sense of guilt. It is characteristic of the neurosis to put a psychic reality above an actual one, and to react as seriously to thoughts as the normal person reacts only towards realities. May it not be true that the case was somewhat the same with primitive men? We are justified in ascribing to them an extraordinary overvaluation of their psychic acts as a partial manifestation of their narcissistic organization. According to this, the mere impulses of hostility towards the father and the existence of the wish fantasy to kill and devour him may have sufficed to bring about the moral reaction which has created totemism and taboo. We should thus escape the necessity of tracing back the beginning of our cultural possession, of which we rightly are so proud, to a horrible crime which wounds all our feelings. The causal connection, which stretches from that beginning to the present time, would not be impaired, for the psychic reality would be of sufficient importance to account for all these consequences. It may be agreed that a change has really taken place in the form of society from the father horde to the brother clan. This is a strong argument, but it is not conclusive. The change might have been accomplished in a less violent manner and still have conditioned the appearance of the moral reaction. As long as the pressure of the primal father was felt, the hostile feelings against him were justified, and repentance at these feelings had to wait for another opportunity. Of as little validity is the second objection, that everything derived from the ambivalent relation to the father, namely taboos and rules of sacrifice, is characterized by the highest seriousness and by complete reality. The ceremonials and inhibitions of compulsion neurotics exhibit this characteristic too, and yet they go back to a merely psychic reality, to resolution and not to execution. We must beware of introducing the contempt for what is merely thought or wished, which characterizes our sober world where there are only material values, into the world of primitive man and the neurotic, which is full of inner riches only. We face a decision here which is really not easy. But let us begin by acknowledging that the difference which may seem fundamental to others does not in our judgment touch the most important part of the subject. If wishes and impulses have the full value of fact for primitive man, it is for us to follow such a conception intelligently instead of correcting it according to our standard. But in that case we must scrutinize more closely the prototype of the neurosis itself, which is responsible for having raised this doubt. It is not true the compulsion neurotics, who today are under the pressure of over-morality, defend themselves only against the psychic reality of temptations and punish themselves for impulses which they have only felt. A piece of historic reality is also involved. In their childhood these persons had nothing but evil impulses, and as far as their childish impotence permitted, they put them into action. Each of these over-good persons had a period of badness in his childhood and a perverse phase as a forerunner and a premise of the later over-morality. The analogy between primitive men and neurotics is therefore much more fundamentally established if we assume that with the former too the psychic reality, concerning whose structure there is no doubt, originally coincided with the actual reality, and that primitive men really did what according to all testimony they intended to do. But we must not let our judgment about primitive men be influenced too far by the analogy with neurotics. Differences must also be taken into account. Of course, the sharp division between thinking and doing, as we draw it, does not exist either with savages or with neurotics. But the neurotic is above all inhibited in his actions. With him the thought is a complete substitute for the deed. Primitive man is not inhibited. The thought is directly converted into the deed. The deed is for him, so to speak, rather a substitute for the thought. And for that reason I think we may well assume, in the case we are discussing, though without vouching for the absolute certainty of the decision, that in the beginning was the deed. End of part 3 of chapter 4. End of chapter 4. End of Totem and Taboo by Sigmund Freud. Read by Mary Schneider.